So the first thing I want to ask you, lovely ladies, is what are some common mistakes that people make around podcasting?
You want to go first, Melanie? I'll jump in.
Yeah, sure.
Well, I eat my soup.
Great question, Deb. So a couple of things that people, in my opinion, people make when podcasting is they get caught up in the technology or a bit overwhelmed with, oh my God, you know, it's too technical and I need a microphone and a whole lot of things, editing software, when actually you don't need a whole lot of stuff, and podcasting is quite easy to start. So you can start simple and then you can get a bit more complicated and complex as and when you need to, and if you want to go down that path. So that's probably the first thing I'd say. The next thing I'd say is around not having a strategy, so not knowing why podcast. You need to know why you're doing it. And that links into the third point, which is around knowing who you want to speak to and who you want to connect with. So who's your audience? Who do you want to connect with via your podcast? Who are you speaking to when you get in front of the microphone and record your podcast? And then the fourth thing that I would say is just not starting. A lot of people say, oh, I want to start a podcast, and they never do it. And
trying to be perfect, which doesn't actually exist.
Exactly. And you know what? When we all look back on the things we did earlier in our careers or our first podcasts, and Annemarie can probably talk to this, and when we first did videos and things like that, we look back and think, oh my gosh, what were we doing? But it's only that when we started, we got better because we knew what we could improve because we were in action and we were doing it. So I would just encourage everybody just to have a go.
No, very true. And it's also true what you said, that people focus, because I've heard this a lot, and I'm pretty sure I've heard this around networks that Annemarie, you and I have been part of too, that have asked this to you as well, that people are so worried about the tools that they actually forget that you do need a strategy and you need things like that as well, and you need to know what you're doing and where you're going with your podcast. Before we do go on to strategy, Annemarie, is there anything that you want to add in regards to the mistakes that people make?
Yeah, those are all really good points that Melanie mentioned. And I think what I also see happening is that then they think, well, okay, my strategy is I want to do this, this, and this, but they don't go deep enough because of all of the time and energy and effort. And I know both Debbie and Melanie with your podcast, there's a lot of time that goes on behind the scenes, a lot of in some instances hours of work, of research, putting it together by the time you post produce and get it out there. So you really want to make sure that the strategy, and we're going to talk about it in a moment, really does lead you down the path of where you want to end up. And so there's a couple of things that I really stress, and that includes the message. Is it targeted to your niche? Because so often, and I've been in this, I've made every single mistake and then some over the last 11 plus years. And one of the biggest mistakes was not getting so clear on that message and then saying, how am I going to monetize that? Because I assumed that people would listen to my podcast. The first one we were co-hosted, so we were in the hair industry. People would listen and then they would go to my website, see all of their credentials and go, wow, I want to work with Annemarie. But that never happened because assumption, and when you base your strategy on hope that people will do that, is not often the case. And many of us are also consumers of podcasts, and we listen when we're driving. So how often do you listen to something you think, oh, I'm going to make a note of that when I get back to the office? And then someone cuts in front of you or life just happens and then so you never follow up. So, your strategy has to have all of the touch points and taking people on that next step so that it's just not, left to chance.
Okay, so first of all, I have to say this soup is absolutely delicious. So thank you so much for that. It is yum. Second thing I want to say is let's have a look at the strategy. What's the very first thing someone should look at when they're about to do a podcast? Their very first thing.
The end in mind.
Okay.
You can't plot where you're going or a strategy unless you know where you want to go.
Okay, so what would the end in mind be? Because I know some people think, I want to give information to people or I want to help people with something, but there's more to the end than just that, isn't there?
What are you monetizing? If you're a coach or a consultant, what is the product or service or expertise the program that you want to seed and lead, because that is very much going to determine the content. It's going to determine the structure, the format. It's going to determine the calls to action, everything, because every component in your podcast is going to add value. It's going to educate, it's going to engage, and it's going to entice someone to want to take that next step. But unless you know what that next step is, you can't build a strategy around that.
Okay, so educate and engage, those two things are very, very important with that as well. Okay, so the first thing really to find out who's your market, who's your niche market that you're actually doing your podcast for, and what is your outcome in mind. So what is it that you're wanting to monetize? What are you wanting to do as your call to action at the end of that? And then your podcast should be structured in a way that you're actually talking a bit about what's at the end as well.
Yeah, and also, you know, the topics that you share on your show, whether you are lecturing yourself, so it's a solo show, or whether you're interviewing someone, has to add value around the topic or subtopics that you know your ideal client is struggling with.